Alright, blood level 4 runs in Bloodborne are almost always focused around the saw cleaver, the optimal weapon when being at the lowest level. Fast attacks, good base damage, quick enough double charge at 2 attacks to make up for the lack of visceral damage, serration, and a master at building up the beast blood meter. The saw spear has less base damage, but arguably a better moveset, although in the end, playing with either version would lead to a similar enough experience. And if you want to be really fancy in more ways than one, then you might endure all the threats and pain with the threaded cane. However, the one remaining trick weapon that you could even wield in the first place is one that you practically never see in any BL4 challenge, namely the Hunter's Axe. But why is that? After all, on close examination, the Hunter's Axe is an excellent choice for any new player to the game, in my opinion, as it absolutely shines against regular enemies. Really good range, wide sweeping attacks, and most important of all, spin to win. Exodia Obliterate. It even has hyper armor on top of that. And because of its inherently high rally potential, you will also get more health back than with most other weapons. Yes, the axe has a lot of extras, to be exact. But the real question to ask is, what would it be like to go through Bloodborne at the lowest level, wielding the axe instead of the saw cleaver? Well, that does sound like an interesting exercise to me. So let us go on this excursion through Yharnam, and let us see if among this meager selection of BL4 weapons, the axe will either be exquisite, or might as well be axed from the list altogether. Regardless, it is time to see the axe in action. Now before we begin, since I will likely break a sweat, let's apply a little axe first. Hold on a second, I don't even have any armpits. So, without wasting any time, let's start our expedition through the game as a waste of skin, because we have a lot of skin in the game, as we'll be using the axe under extraordinary circumstances, without leveling up. Meaning that we might as well execute the doll, as she serves no purpose for us.
Perfect.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah, I know that might have been excruciating to watch, but it is theme appropriate, as she was my ex-waifu. And believe me, things are going to get hunter sexual enough anyway. Oh yeah. So, after a quick exploration through the early game, I leveled up my axe to +2. Now, surely the cleric beast would not prove to be a bridge too far, because this is pretty much what any normal playthrough with this weapon would still be like at this point in the game. But we do immediately notice two major flaws that this weapon has over our other available options. First of all, the lack of serration, because a 20% boost against beast is based and badass basically. For comparison, the red tearstone ring in Dark Souls 3 provides a 20% damage boost for being at low health, so this is not exactly an insignificant amount. And the second issue is that this weapon inflicts blunt damage. Yes, whatever dunces decided that a dull blade would make sense for this weapon are, just like this weapon, not exactly the sharpest tools in the shed. And I definitely have an axe to grind with them. Because at least on paper, blunt damage is the worst damage type in the game. Almost nothing is weak to it, beasts are resistant to it, and we already lack serration, and kin are extremely resistant to it. So I'm not sure if a blunt blade is gonna cut it. Meaning I'm already getting a hint as to why in a BL4 challenge people tell this weapon basically just to go fuck itself. But whoa, no need for expletives yet. I'm sure the axe also has redeeming qualities. Unfortunately, and perhaps ironically, backstabbing is not one of them. As it's rather slow, which is a problem because on BL4 you want to do 2 charge 2 attacks in a row rather than a visceral when you get past the early game, and you also cannot angle it the way you can with the saw cleaver. However, if we open up our music box of tricks against Gascoigne, we have the Deus Ex Machina of backstab opportunities available to us. Now of course there are beasts all over the chop shop, and Daddy G will be one of them sooner than later. But here I did encounter a redeeming quality of the axe, because even though I missed the actual backstab repeatedly, charge 2 attacks will smash humanoid enemies into the ground. So even when you do happen to miss his back, he still couldn't do lumberjack shit against me. Although it wasn't even my intention to do it this way. So let's just call it a happy accident. So then I went to Old Yarnum to upgrade my axe to +3 and made my way to the vital fluid favoring fauna, the terror whose skin flaps in the night, which is another fight where you would go for backstabs. And to emphasize again, at this point in the game, visceral attacks are definitely still viable. But since when it comes to obtaining backstabs, this weapon will not even have your back per se, so if it's too much to handle, you can extend the handle to take its extended form for a spin. To win, to be exact. Because this will actually launch the beast through the air. Of course with the added danger that it could potentially fly away if it would flap its flayed skin around a bit more. Of course the real danger would be the poison, but in addition to antidotes, wearing Gascoigne's set with its high poison resistance is the perfect answer for when the beast chooses to spray it rather than say it. I guess I also could have increased the challenge by not wearing any clothes at all, but contrary to what you might expect, I'm not an exhibitionist. Alright, back to Cathedral Pimple, or Cathedral Ward, whatever. Because now it's time to collect twin Bloodstone shards in order to upgrade to +5. Although technically we could make it to +6 by also going to Hypogean Gao, but we don't need to take things to the extreme yet. In fact, we already have an additional blood gem, since the axe, contrary to the saw and cane, has a triangular gem slot instead of a waning one. And of course with 0 insight inside the witch's boss fight, it takes 0 skill to win anyway. Especially when you can spin to win. Unless you run into the everlasting problem of not being able to tell which witch is which witch, because when you cannot tell which witch is which witch, the witches turn into telekinetic bitches, which is a one-shot on BL4. Yeah. Well, no rest for the Ham Wicket, so let's try again and be a bit more careful this time. Although I guess I shouldn't be surprised that even these old ladies were trying to grab me, because becoming irresistible to the ladies is an inevitable result of the X effect. Well, unless it involves a highly pious and religious lady like Vicar Amelia, who by the way is another beast who is resistant to blunt damage, and is normally an enemy who you can stunlock with beast blood and fast attacks, to the point that she can't even counterattack at all. But I don't think that the axe will be nearly as efficient as the saw cleaver would be. But hey, I am hungry for a real fight, and what better way to satisfy that hunger than by getting a meal in ya. Well, I decided to go for the smaller version of the axe to get as close as possible, at least, to the speed of the saw cleaver. However, even at +5, with beast blood and fire paper, although certainly not bad by any means, but the difference is indeed very noticeable. And extending the axe, ironically, extended the fight. So it was mainly the fact that any +5 weapon will perform well at this point in the game, in addition to using my experience that allowed my axe head to behead and excommunicate the head of the church without exerting myself too much. And thus, let us head into the woods. Ah yes, that's exactly where an axe feels right at home. Regardless, let's not lumber around, because we need to quickly collect a few things here. First of all, a blunt damage boosting gem behind my fellow executioner, but he's even duller than my blade to even notice me. Of course, if he had been intelligent, he would have been an execution nerd. But that's not even the only gem we need to pick up, because remember that we can make use of triangular ones. And there is a nursing gem that in most cases wouldn't fill up your gem slot. However, despite also picking up the Kano summons, I decided for once to take a different route, exclusive to this video. Because you can also obtain Bloodstone chunks in the Nightmare Frontier in order to upgrade to +7. At least if I can make it past the frenzy-inducing Winter Lantern. Well, I did manage to get out of her sight, but then I still died. Because frenzy keeps building up regardless. I suppose that is what's known as frenzy with benefits. Regardless, here is a friendly reminder that the uncharged R2 attacks of the axe go vertical. Because if you want to make your enemies go horizontal, you will need to utilize every aspect of your armament. So did I somehow still get squashed underneath Amygdala's arm? Wow, I guess that the Amygdalan arm is the superior armament after all. I suppose that makes sense because Amygdala ends up literally dual wielding his own arms with both hands. Although ironically, I still had the reach advantage, as he could not reach me when I was right in front of him. So, despite his superior armament, he still took it on the chin. And I bet he was all up in arms about that. But for me, it was not merely handy, or double handy, it was extra handy. But now let us go back to the forest for the rest of the game. And despite the fact that I cannot level up, I can still acquire more health and more stamina by picking up the clockwise and anti-clockwise runes. But even with that addition, we are still in danger of getting our clocks cleaned, as we are not out of the woods yet. And in this neck of the woods, some shadowy figures come out of the woodworks to breathe down your neck, demanding an explanation of why you are there. Well, my answer to that is to throw shade around. Literally. Sweet. Yes, here we finally have an example where I think that the axe might even outperform the saw cleaver. Because the range advantage, the wide sweeps and the ability to knock the shadows down are truly exciting. However, the transition period was a little bit too close for comfort, as I neither had enough beast blood meter nor did I get a backstab. But when you fail to execute your strategy, you'll either get lucky or you won't. Probably not a 50-50 chance like choosing between axe heads or tails, but whatever the odds, I praised myself even more fortunate when the sidestepping cheese tactic also appears to work with the somewhat slower attacks that the axe has compared to the saw cleaver. Hahaha, candle shadow, someone must extinguish thy flame. Yeah, sorry for acting so dramatic, but sometimes I'm just being a little extra. However, now I had to change from Executioner to Exterminator, because this game is in desperate need of some pest control. Yuck. Disgusting creatures. Make me want to puke. And, hey, what the hell? Yeah, I'm stun-locked by Barf. And that's what you call a vomitable foe. But hey, my character here is an experienced woodswoman, so if they think that they can overpower her ex with excretion, then they are definitely barfing up the wrong tree. Nah, they are all barf and no bite. In fact, although I thought about building up beast blood on Rom's head in order to use the one cycle strategy, I decided against it. However, I still almost managed to stop Rom from spinning around like a CD-ROM. Not a one cycle, but with that little health remaining, I decided to just quickly rush in order to quickly get the final hits. Perhaps in hindsight not the brightest idea, but against a spider this vacuous, it is comparatively speaking a genius move. After all, Rom is in the end nothing more than an Arak nitwit. But of course I was definitely smart enough to go and upgrade to +9 before the next fights. So bloodstone chunks, the plus 18% blood gem, and even bolt papers were my Yara goals that I needed to acquire. After all, I could not yet buy any bolt paper with either echoes or insight. But that was about to change as I decided to acquire the Spark Hunter badge first, which would allow me to purchase those using either method. And therefore it was time to exhume the corpse of the Dark Beast, who despite being a little more than bone, is still somehow more resistant to blunt damage. However, its main weakness is being fought at this point in the game because of its lower scaling. And despite not having the speed of the saw cleaver, the one thing my axe excels at is knocking things down by using the heavy heft of its heavy extended heft. Because when you can keep the Dark Beast down on the ground, you won't have to worry about any of his parlor tricks. And the exact same thing applies to the other but more extensive pile of bones, the one reborn. However, when it comes to using heavy attacks to knock things down a peg, this boss is the exception, because that approach actually got me killed. So instead I needed to hatchet the plan and decided to use the speed of its smaller hatchet form, at least for the initial knockdown. Because remember that the best method of building up beast blood meter with the saw cleaver is by making use of transform attacks. However, that's not unique to that weapon specifically. Transform attacks of the axe also build up the meter extremely fast. And that's a good thing, because even at full meter, and with my fastest attacks, my damage output is substantially less than the saw cleaver. So I only barely made it through in time, because I literally ran out of limbs to break. Which I'm quite aware sounds weird given the design of this boss. But in the end, despite having barely any meat left on his bones, the one reborn was still chopped liver. But I suppose so was I, because now I made a mistake. Possibly a result of not streaming a run for once, because someone should have told me to just cleave patches alone. And in twain, but after talking to him first. Because he doesn't actually drop the second tier stamina rune, he only gives it to you when you talk to him first. Meaning that now I cannot get it anymore. Yeah, I might be exaggerating a bit, but I believe that this 10-year-old game still might require a few additional patches. And of course the downside of not being able to acquire more stamina is the fact that we now need to chase a boss that I would like to classify as excrement. Fortunately, you can practically prevent him from Mickey lashing out at you by making use of transform attacks. In fact, I believe I rattled his cage so much that I gave Mickey the Cage Dickie an existential crisis afterwards. Unfortunately, the nightmare swirls and churns unending, like the amount of elbow grease it takes to shove your entire arm up a pig's rear end. However, despite turning the pig into a literal pork chop, I felt pretty swindled when the second swine swooped me against a tree, barely worthy of the name of all things. Because I know I'm carving out my own niche, but there's definitely some irony in getting stuck against wood while holding an iron instrument specifically designed for chopping wood. I guess that instead of acquiring expertise, my executional skills are still in its infancy. Which is a shame, because I felt it would be more appropriate if I could at least have matured into my teenage years to execute the aristocratic oppressor in a more elegant manner. Well, to be fair, that's probably not very lore accurate anyway, so I have no idea what possessed me to do that. But speaking of possession, with the ghostly appearance of the wet nurse, I feel like it's time for an exorcism. Or perhaps I'm turning mad as a meat axe, and I'm not merely just seeing things, I am also not seeing things. Well, at least I was happy to see how my beast blood meter would fill up rather quickly by using transform attacks, with the added benefit of some extra range. And although I was a little on edge, waiting for the axe to fall, in the end nothing bad happened at all. As long as you can avoid the nightmare phase. Which for the few people who might still not be aware of it, is a projectile that can be dodged. So all in all, this boss was nursing its wounds in no time. And I was able to throw a wet blanket on this sinister living wet nurse blanket. Oh, and on an unrelated side note, the wet nurse is the only boss, to my knowledge at least, that for whatever reason drops the same amount of blood echoes on every game cycle. Whether it's new game or New Game Plus 6, it will always be the same amount. Oh, and another thing you probably didn't know, in fact I didn't know it either, but playing the part of the executioner gave me so much bloodlust that I decided to even attack the horse and carriage that go together like love and marriage and should normally take you to Canehurst. But if you attack them, they actually disappear, leaving me as a death sentence criminal victim to my colleagues around here. I almost feared that I cut myself off from Canehurst altogether, but fortunately the horses and the Canehurst hearse were merely rehearsing, so let's stop horsing around and take the hearse to Canehurst. Because we need to step into high gear to reach Logirius, although the fight against him was not exactly going by quickly and definitely not going smoothly. In fact, I think it has something to do with speed as to why the saw cleaver can practically cheese Logarius in his first phase by making him backstep constantly, but the slower attacks of the axe don't make that possible. And going from backsteps to backstabs, well, we already know that the axe doesn't shine there either. However, despite the fact that I basically didn't even get any more backstabs in the first place, meaning that my damage wasn't exactly going through the roof, but Logarius himself did almost go through the roof, because of me repeatedly smashing him down into it. Perhaps he can even be knocked around with the spin to win attack, but I didn't attempt that unfortunately. And speaking of attempts, although he did go down, repeatedly, on the first one, but it was definitely less elegant than with the saw cleaver, but I guess in the end still adequate. Not an actual crowning achievement, but let's just pretend it is one. Although I do have to say, if you choose to not use the saw cleaver, I still believe that the cane hurts him more than the axe would. Unfortunately, what was next on the list is where the axe should hurt the least. Well, then again, when you hit a wall, that hurts me quite a lot, I must say. But the point is that kin are extremely resistant to blunt damage. So it's a good thing that you can still spin to win to knock them down. Or, can you? Damn it, these enemies suck. Well, the benefit that the nitrous has, another blunt force trauma inducing blunt object, is that it has inherent bolt to its blunt. But fortunately, I can also add bolt to my blunt damage. At least with paper. But on paper, this weapon should be horrible against the aliens. However, not only is their health pool already quite low, but with my wide swinging attacks, I can build up beast blood and take them all down at the same time. Now of course these aren't actually aliens at all, in fact they were once human, but no matter what they were, whether victims of experimentation, being extraterrestrial, or exalted beings, now they definitely no longer exist. But the brightest unfortunately still does, and as expected this didn't work out too well. No easy chopped calamari here. She is the boss and she's definitely in charge. Abritus is already a very RNG heavy fight, because if she does a lot of head slams, she's easy. If she doesn't, it's a shit show. In this case, an excrement show. So I suppose it would have been smarter to fight her up close and build up beast blood, rather than simply waiting for good RNG. But I'm not the brightest bulb in the socket, meaning that I could go and suck it. The only benefit that this weapon has is that the dash attack in the extended form can easily, well, somewhat easily-ish, hit Abritus' head when she's doing the not-so-friendly frenzy spit. Although despite it being a thrusting attack, it evidently doesn't count as thrust damage, unfortunately. So all in all, this was mostly an excruciating experience. So much so that I just rushed her final laser attack in order to rely on my player-specific power of resurrection in order to come back alive, whereas the bosses will stay dead. Regardless, with the main game completed, except for the two final bosses, how exactly is the axe holding up compared to the saw cleaver? Well, by its handle, obviously. But other than that, you can handle the main game with the axe, even at BL4, without it becoming too much of a chore. Not exactly an exceptional weapon, but also not exhausting to use it, despite its higher stamina consumption, in addition to me missing out on the second stamina tier rune, which I probably should have cut out and excluded from the video in the first place in hindsight. Nevertheless, the run is not done. There is still the DLC, or dare I say, the expansion of the game. Although I would rather go to Hawaii or some other exotic place like that. Regardless, this is definitely the part where you can't just blunt force your way through anymore, and where the advantages of the saw became clear to see. First of all, serration for against Ludwig and Lawrence, and backstabs for against Orphan and Maria. Oh, but weapon choice aside, what the hell was this supposed to be? I got underneath Ludwig, broke the wrong leg and then got stuck between his legs. Now that is a coffee cup filled to the brim with fuck and topped with whipped cream. But that aside, although it didn't feel all that different using the axe over the saw experientially, but a very noticeable difference was how much longer the fight took with this weapon. Other than some weird RNG slowing the first phase down immensely, exactly why things took so much longer was not self-evident, or dare I say, axiomatic. Because it was especially noticeable in his second phase, which is ironically when he loses his weakness to serration. But it is in fact possible to drain away Ludwig's health very quickly with the saw cleaver, especially when empowered with beast blood, and because you can make use of his scripted staggers. But this time around, I had enough time to recite the entire alphabet, all the way down to X. In other words, the weapon itself provided no benefit, and it was simply my experience getting me through. A matter of doing X, Y, and Z, but ironically more emphasis on the Y, and a little bit on Z because it took so long. And when things were finally done, I even failed to behead his already beheaded head with the head of my axe. Wow, what a treasure this weapon is. X marks the spot my ass. Well, good thing I'm not literally a court-ordered executioner, because I'm not even able to complete anyone's sentence with an exclamation point. Damn it, I feel like such a failure now. But at least, I'm still alive. And speaking of which, now we got to the worst part of the playthrough with this weapon. Although to be fair, even with the saw cleaver, this is already a pain in the dick. And I prefer to use the spawn killing cheese tactic, which unfortunately is already kind of RNG dependent and difficult to execute properly. But ironically, trying with the executioner's axe quickly led me to excuse myself and just settle in for a long and drawn out and frankly quite miserable fight. The only upside is that my axe is quite long as well, if I choose it to be. But other than that, for the love of fuck, don't use this weapon in this fight. Not even bolt paper made enough of a difference. Because to come back to the Tonitrus comparison, that one adds quite a lot of bolt damage, whereas bolt paper only adds a little bit. Of course, the benefit that the axe has is that it has much higher durability, meaning that it takes quite a bit longer before it's past its expiration date. By the way, speaking of long drawn out fights that I rather wouldn't do, you can actually inflict fall damage upon the failures. So if anyone else, very much emphasis on anyone else, is in the mood to suffer the worst kind of suffering, there you go, fall damage only living failures. But just like the invention of the atom bomb, just because you could, doesn't necessarily mean that you should. However, making an axe doll of Maria, assuming that Maria was indeed Gurman's axe, but that is arguably a much better invention. And when it comes to Proto-Doll Maria, in her first phase you can actually knock the spin to wind out of her, which, if it were more consistent, could even be considered a cheese tactic, and almost as fun to do as fun do. However, what is especially inconsistent is when, why, or how it is determined whether she has hyper armor / poise. Because you can flatten her with a charger 2 attack in hatchet form, but evidently only when she feels like it. But good thing that it is at least a possibility, because unlike getting double charge R2 attacks in with the saw cleaver for massive damage, given that visceral attacks are practically worthless at this point at BL4, I honestly didn't even get a single backstab this time. Yes, at this point we're really starting to notice why the axe never became popular on BL4. Because it took quite a while before I managed to clean her clock. However, that's still nowhere near how long it would take to clean her clock tower afterwards. And whatever cleaning product you choose, make sure it's not product X, because that never performs well in the commercials. Anyway, I then quickly made my way towards Orphan, past all the different locations where there's an invading NPC, who simply goes from door to door. But our goal is the shore, where we encounter the Orphan of Cause. Another example of a fight that's all about backstabbing, especially on BL4. Unfortunately, as expected, double charge R2 attacks are too slow with this weapon, meaning that you'll have to settle for a transform attack or a visceral, which is of course far less effective, even with the 20% claw mark rune. Although Beast Blood definitely helps. So what I settled on was to follow up with an uncharged R2 attack. Which in all fairness is still a decent enough substitute if you ask me. Just not to the same extent. However, it does have the additional knockdown in the second phase, just like the saw cleaver. Although since I would be out of stamina, I could only at best sneak a quick R1 attack in afterwards. Possibly would have been helpful if I hadn't killed Patches and obtained the second stamina rune, earlier on. In fact, with the saw cleaver, you can actually get 3 charged R2 attacks plus a visceral in if you have all 3 stamina runes equipped, including the tier 3 one from the chalice dungeons. I got nowhere near that kind of effectiveness here, of course. But still, in the end, the conclusion of a post-mortem examination would be that an axe was the cause of death. Or as some would say, the cosm of death. But of course, something much more deadly than the power of an axe is the power of an explosion. And Lawrence has way too many of those. And getting many hits in with this weapon is trickier than with other trick weapons. Not to mention the lack of serration, as 20% bonus damage given Lawrence's giant health pool is very noticeable. Especially when Beast Blood buildup is less as well. Which could have increased my damage exponentially. Oh, and when he starts crawling around, don't use dash attacks anymore. Especially not with the extended form. After all, this part is all about being in control of your spacing. So instead, be in hatchet form and just pretend that you are using the cleaver. Which you would rather be using anyway. Or as I would say in my language, ik heb liever de cleaver. Well, that's actually more Dunglish, but anyway. And with that, the 2 final bosses are all that is left. And I decided to go for the old school BL4 approach against Gurman. Parrying. However, not for a visceral, but the point of parrying is to create damage opportunities and hit him while he is in the instability state, meaning that he takes additional bonus damage. In a second phase, I tried to make use of the dash attacks in extended form for the additional reach, with mixed results. After all, Gurman does a lot of dashing there too. But fortunately, also a lot of turning. And when that happens, he doesn't have a leg to stand on. Well, he has 1 leg to stand on, I suppose. But given that he only has 1 leg to stand on, that tends to bring him down a peg. Also, based on how a lot of other people play, you don't need to spam dash backwards during the wind projectile and just hope to dodge it, because the wind projectile is designed to spawn right next to you. In other words, you need to keep an eye on the right side of the screen, and then you can quite easily avoid it, because you already know where it's going to be. Well, unless your back is to a wall, of course, then your chances of survival are kind of up in the air. So, in the end, what conclusion can we draw about the axe? Would I now consider myself an expert, who explicitly exemplifies an exodus from using the saw cleaver exclusively on BL4? Well, nah. Although it did kind of exonerate itself a bit. It's definitely not bad by any means, but also not really all that good either. It's merely alright. But unfortunately, merely alright. And not as how I would like to say it, alright. And that is, after all, the X factor that makes all the difference, if you ask me. Sorry, if you would X me.